Farming food and fashion for a discerning world is serious business in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are new opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Well, kia ora and welcome to another week in Sarah's Country, a world of opportunity and optimism in the face of exponential change facing farming, food and fashion. Now, if you are an avid listener or watcher of the Opinion Maker series, you will know that we like to unearth tools and advice for our farmers and growers to navigate these changes. And how I unearth these topics is from our wonderful network, you, our listeners and watchers. It's like a self-perpetuation happening. It's incredible. And it's all because you get in touch via email at sarah@sarahscountry.com and then say, hey, Sarah, what about we talk about XYZ? Or you need to cover this or talk to this person. Of course, I also have a wonderfully rich network. We have our Sarah's Country Brains Trust on our Facebook group, 5,000 connections on LinkedIn, and there is always topics. It's one of the biggest questions I get. How on earth do you keep up with the content? There's content everywhere. It's choosing what the right direction to go down is. It truly is becoming an amazing place to come together and connect around ideas. And that actually is the biggest reward that I can ask for doing Sarah's Country. I know from some heated discussions and the messaging that is circulating around both in rural media and at industry events that I have attended, this knowing your number business is actually getting a bit fearful for farmers around what it actually means. And there's calculators that are out there that seem too simple for farmers. They want more detail of how these numbers have been brought together. So when really, one number that they want to focus on so much to actually stay in business is called earnings before interest, depreciation and tax, right? Balancing economic and environmental. It's also becoming quite apparent as David Parker, Minister for the Environment, has recently dropped the proposed nitrogen bottom line for 12 months anyway, as a trade-off in the proposed essential freshwater package, with the Ministry for Primary Industries saying we have to give some farmers some economic stability and weigh up the economic impacts, of course, alongside environmental. So can the two play together? I am becoming more and more a fascinated student in this space of environmental economics. If you like, a great book I'm reading at the moment is called Donut Economics and touches on this ludicrousy that humans have developed around infinite economic growth in planetary boundaries. So we're sort of on the same track when an email came in triggering this particular opinion maker theme. It's a solution to these current basic calculators that farmers are trying to grapple with that helps predict the economics of environmental changes. And it was prompted by Tom Kay, who tuned into the recent Sarah's Country Opinion Maker titled He Waka Eka Noa, Knowing Your Number, a month or so back. And he writes this: at one stage, you asked Kelly Forster, the program director for He Waka Eka Noa, when it comes to gross emissions, is it just going to be as simple as science that we have to reduce livestock and cut back fertiliser, cut back on diesel? He said he was really interested in this question because, in his opinion, there is a massive opportunity to reduce emissions and nitrate leaching whilst maintaining and increasing profitability with the science that we have now, just as Rick Burke, the farmer that we had on that program, has done. The problem is, he says, that it can be very hard for farmers to figure out how to get that position of a win-win, or very hard for them to believe that it's even possible. Tom points out then to me that he sits on the environmental reference group for New Zealand's largest farmer, Pamu, and his role with forest and bird as a freshwater advocate makes him think that the New Zealand farming community need to know more about this particular tool that we will unpack over the next hour. It is actually approved also by He Waka Eka Noa, but is just not as well known. It's very different from other farm system models and very much more than a calculator to know your current number. So I was naturally intrigued and I picked up the phone to Tom to find out the answer to predicting the cost and profit outcome of amending nutrient outputs and emission targets easily without having to make educated guesses on what these changes will mean for your farm management and profitability. So it's called the E2E Model. And you know what? This isn't actually new. To briefly explain how it actually works, I'll give you a small example. Let's say you want to decrease your nutrient output by 20% without adversely affecting profitability. Rather than running a model over and over with different input scenarios in an attempt to achieve this outcome, E2M would simply set that output and indicate to the model that it should attempt to maximize profit within this constraint. And this is where it differs, essentially helping the farmer figure out how to get to the ultimate outcome of reducing yet remaining profitable. I have your attention. Well, this, as I said, is not new, and it was tried and true with the Lincoln University dairy farm, who used it to reduce inputs, reduce the size of its herd from 630 to 560 cows, and reduce nitrogen leaching by 30%. All whilst increasing production from 400 kilograms of milk solids to over 500. Yes, you are sitting up and paying attention. Good, because over the next hour we have three gentlemen, including Tom Kay himself, as I said, forest and bird freshwater advocate, who realises that to have environmental change, the economics need to be right. Along with Matt Johnson, a former Pamu dairy farmer manager and now senior business manager, who works alongside Tom in this environment reference group, and also of the man himself, the developer of the E2E model, agricultural analysis and former ex-Massey University agricultural economist and farm systems specialist, Barrie Ridler. All that up next, and I'm really, really excited that you are interested in how New Zealand can make land use changes to stack up to the bank manager. Sit back and listen for this innovative show I'm really excited to get into. Tom explains it's different to everything else the industry works with, and there is enormous untapped opportunity for change. And Tom joins us now. Tom, thank you so much for reaching out and listening to that previous episode. I'd like to start by saying that, most freshwater ecologists or advocates are usually on the outset are pretty provocative when it comes to farmers. But you certainly have a way of uniting around some practical progression on this topic. Could you give us a little bit about your journey from studying at Massey University, meeting Barrie, and getting into this position of sitting in a Pamu boardroom?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, I work for Forest and Bird. I have been the freshwater advocate here for about 12 months. I'm actually just transitioning back to be a regional conservation manager now that our freshwater advocate's back from maternity leave. But I studied at Massey University. I was part of the School of Agriculture and the Environment. Our environmental science degree was very closely aligned with the work that was going on at the Massey dairy farms and all that kind of stuff. Similar lecturers and crossover. And have since gone on and got a Master's of Science in Ecology. But during my time at Massey, I basically had to look into an environmental issue in New Zealand. And at the time, the Ruataniwha Dam was a huge, huge issue. And I basically found some reports that were being done for the regional council at the time, looking at the costs and benefits of irrigation. Was this water that was going to be supplied at 26 cents a cubic metre actually going to be, were farmers going to be able to afford to pay that premium for water and make enough money to kind of offset that cost by intensifying their farm and all that kind of thing? And there had been this modelling that had been done by Barrie Riddler for the regional council that kind of said, well, look, actually the cost of all this extra water and the infrastructure cost of intensifying a farm to make it work and all that, that's not really going to outweigh, the money that you might make off some of the increased production you get. And increasingly, I kind of went down this rabbit hole of what this model was, that it had been used to help Lincoln University Dairy Farm kind of increase their efficiencies on their farms, that other regional councils had started looking at using this to figure out whether they could reach emissions targets and how farmers could meet nutrient leaching targets and things like that. And I thought there's a huge untapped opportunity here. And I guess to kind of to step back a bit, as you say, we've got these environmental issues in New Zealand with agriculture, leaching and emissions in particular. Farmers are being asked to figure out where they kind of sit now with what their impacts are. But they've also got to figure out how we're going to reach these targets that regional councils have and that we have with Hawaka Ekino or the Climate Commission. And most of the models we've got out there kind of let you punch in this data to go, well, where am I at now? What's my farm system? What are my emissions? But the E2E model is really different. And like you say, you get that picture of what your farm is now, but rather than kind of having to tweak all the inputs and go, how do I get there? How do I get here? You can actually just go straight to the other end and say, look, I want to reduce my emissions by 20%. And the model's just going to run all these different scenarios for you based on your farm system to kind of figure out if you can get there and the most efficient and most profitable way for you to get there. I liken it a bit to having a paper map. It's like we're being given a paper map and someone said to you, look, this is where you are and I want you to get over there and you've got to figure out which roads you're going to take and whatever. Being given an E2M is a bit like being given an iPhone with Google Maps on it, and you kind of just punch in where you are and where you want to get to, and it's going to figure out the most efficient way to get you there.
And the thing is too, is that being a bit of an economics geek at school, there's actually a relatively, as explained, underutilised economic technique that we have really missed the boat on in farming when we have been all about production. And this whole point of marginal analysis, which we'll get into with Barrie a lot more, but it really is about the tipping point whereby all this extra work is for no real marginal benefit or return long term. So how does this tie in with the Environment Reference Group, Tom, and the work and advice that you're doing with Pamu?
Yeah, so as you say, like a lot of our farm systems kind of rhetoric through time has been, increase production and you will make more money. We wanted to double exports, all that kind of thing. But with that came a huge increase in, things like bought-in feed and fertilizer, and systems were kind of being pushed beyond their natural kind of grass growth curve. You were kind of supplementing it with all this bought-in feed and things like that. And the cost of doing all that was a cost to the environment through leaching and impacts and things like that, but also actually a cost to the farmer. That additional feed and all that kind of stuff is really outweighing any extra money that they're making, and we're not operating at that point where, as you say, where the marginal costs, those extra costs of making that extra production, equal out with those marginal returns, the money that you're actually going to make off it. So we've pushed our systems really far, and we can actually come back quite a way while still being profitable or potentially being more profitable and reducing a whole bunch of those environmental impacts. So there's a win-win here, and that's I think, well, Barrie will say why it's called the Enviro-Economic Model.
Yeah.
And the opportunity there with Pamu is, Pamu's really trying to lead the way in New Zealand. It's New Zealand's biggest farmer, I think, and we've got a huge range of operations across the country, really looking for opportunities to decrease their impacts while still obviously having to meet a bottom line as a state-owned enterprise. And this model kind of presents a really great opportunity to go, well, where are our farm systems now and how do we get there? And that's kind of the aim of the Environmental Reference Group, is to sit kind of as a critical friend of Pamu and say, look, this is where we see things going and where policy's going and where we think we need to go for environmental health. Here's some stuff that we're seeing out there that we think offers an opportunity for you. And then Pamu has the expertise on farm to kind of make those things happen.
And just lastly, Tom, before we go to Barrie to learn more about this model, the ability for the likes of freshwater advocates like Forest and Bird and our freshwater science community, who've been incredibly vocal towards the farming community through the press, the time to unite ministries between the primary industries' fear of economic viability against the Ministry for the Environment's and environmental outcomes they're trying to achieve. Do you believe that we've got to a point of maturity in the conversation that we can balance the dollars with environmental sense now in the conversations you are having?
Yeah, I think there are going to be a lot of situations where we can acknowledge that actually if we stop chasing production and we start looking at the more profitable more profitable positions on farms within environmental limitations, because I think we can all be now, we've got to a point where we can say, look, climate change is a massive issue, freshwater quality is a massive issue. If we can acknowledge that we can be profitable within those constraints, then there's huge opportunities across the country to kind of bring farming back into a sustainable position. It's not going to work everywhere. We've got some really some places that maybe shouldn't be farmed with the intensity that they are being farmed. But even then, a tool like E2M can kind of help you go, look, where's my farm now? I know what catchment I'm in. I know kind of where I need to get to meet the environmental bottom lines that we want to get to, or maybe even further aspirations. Can the model get me to that outcome in a profitable way? And if it can, great. If it can't, then at least and you can start working out what your pathway is to kind of, what your options are.
Barrie Ridler joining us now, the developer of the E2E model, and it's been described as the most efficient at finding optimal resource use allocations due to its ability to optimize rather than simulate the outcomes and the inputs. Barrie, congratulations on what you've achieved. This is not something that's of recent, I note, and it has been, quite some time ago that you developed this model and worked with Lincoln University and even our government. How come it's taken till now that we're having widespread conversations around the model?
Well, I think Tom touched on that. Basically, it was... it seems I have a lot of bad timing in my life. Just as the MAP policy were looking at it and evaluating it and peer reviewing it, a new government changed and we had a production by 2025, doubling production. And so all the emphasis went away from looking at environment at all towards just basically doubling production. And I pointed out in a slide at that time, actually to a Fish and Game conference there, that if in fact we wanted to do what was required, we would need another 2 billion kilograms of dry matter throughout New Zealand. And that probably meant that there wouldn't be any forest or bird left. So basically, that's where it all started. It was then a hard road, and it has been ever since. And the policy changes in the opposite direction have occurred now. And so there's the possibility to do something. So Tom gave a fairly good, like a good introduction. And I would take his paper map a little bit further and say that because it's orientated towards farmers, what we do is we sort of make sure along the way that rather than just take them from this point to the point where they may want to be or have to be, we can call into the fish and chip shop or something like that along the way and investigate the sorts of things and the sorts of questions that they ask. Once the model is set up, it's very, very quick, and maybe Matt will talk about that later, but it is very, very rapid. And the reason for that is not my expertise in intelligence at all. It's all to do with a very, very innovative small software firm called System Software Instrumentation, who are based in Christchurch. And I've done some work looking at a database system for Charolais back in the late 90s, and that was on linked over the internet. So I went back to them, and basically they put this together, and nobody else, I don't think anybody else could have done it. It's totally different to any other model that's out in the industry in New Zealand, and I believe in the world. And it's purely because they have the knowledge and the sort of techniques to be able to put it together. So it's not an LP as such, linear programming. It's not a spreadsheet-based program. It's basically a database system based on JADE, object orientation. So it really took a lot of things coming together in 2006 through to 2009. And then, to answer your question yet again, Sarah, it got quashed. It was no longer relevant to New Zealand.
sometimes life is purely about those stars aligning, and I couldn't think of a better time for E2M to absolutely fly from my very brief of the technical forward that Tom sent me. And I'm not actually surprised that the Charolais were connected to this, because particularly, their story of optimal management of production in a short period of time, they are really sitting quite pretty when it comes to these environmental targets as well. So there's a lot of things lining up for a lot of people who fundamentally are trying to do the right thing. And it's nice that you've both acknowledged that the farming community has been driven hard to increase production and therefore efficiency being the driver, because obviously price per kilogram has been that one incentive. And it's really interesting, Barrie, also too, that there's a rhetoric that we won't achieve value for just simply doing the right thing. So profitability is now going to have to come from a reduction of costs, but reduction of costs doesn't necessarily mean a reduction of profit from this marginal analysis.
No, well, it is based on diminishing returns. It's a fairly basic concept in production economics or in anything. And so whereas people are basically in New Zealand, as Tom said, they've been following the rainbow, and the curve of the rainbow ends in a pot of gold. But that's at the bottom of the curve. And so where we should be aiming at is where the rainbow stops its upward trajectory and starts to change to a lesser and lesser response. So with all of the other models, they have to, because of the way that they work, and that's no reflection on them, but basically they're straight lines. And so when you've got a straight line and it's an upward straight line, where do you stop putting in resources? Because it appears that every step you take is going to end up with an increase in money. And it will, but what we forget is that the costs of doing so, as you've already pointed out, the costs of doing so increase as well, and they increase at an increasing rate compared to your profit or the margin between them, as the curve moves across from sort of upward trajectory to a flat one. It's again, it was something which I taught at Massey for about 8 years, and it really has been forgotten, as you said. So that particular, when we're looking at the model itself, it works on that each step, and it means that farmers can ask a lot of questions, and the model, we can change the inputs into the model quickly or the output, and they will get an answer. So last week I was with a farmer, and we were there for 2 hours, and basically we went through probably 20 runs of the model, and in each of those runs I believe that he said so as well, he learned more and more about what his farm was, cause and effect, and in fact he had a way forward rather than the sort of murkiness that farmers have got at the moment. It's the worst thing you can have as a farmer. We farmed for 16 years after I'd left Massey, sheep and beef, and the unknowns were the ones that got me down and drove me back out to actually put all of the stuff that I'd put together up to that time, see SSI, and get this thing put together.
It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, fundamentally what I've got here is described as that tipping point where there's no further gains to actually be made. That profit is absolutely as high as possible within the constraints. And there is an example there of, increasing kilos of milk solids over the same land area may not make you any more profitable. And I'll just like, Barrie, before we head to Matt from Pamu, just to see it from their perspective, that example of catching up with the farmer last week, what was some of those outcomes that they were trying to achieve? It wasn't more from the same land, it was just trying to maintain a profit margin of the same from less inputs, such as regulations are stating, the likes of a nitrogen cap?
Yes, partly that. We ended up with that sort of thing, but by then we'd made a lot of progress. Being the way that it's set up, the model can identify what would be termed to be constraints within the system. So at each run that you do, it identifies where the next possible change that will result with more money will be. So under those circumstances, what it will do is point out that you don't have enough quality feed on the place. And so with me at the time was a pasture soils person, and basically he'd already talked with the farmer about some of those issues. And so what it does is it points out that if in fact you can make the changes that are possible within your system at a very low cost, many of them, you will create more opportunities to actually stay within the nitrogen leach cap and the greenhouse gas caps that are coming up, but still make more money because you're adding efficiency to your system. A lot of people talk about how you can overcome some of the issues with the nitrogen leaching and with the greenhouse gas by being more efficient. But the model will actually identify where those efficiencies are, what you can do about them, and how much more benefit you'll get from them, rather than just sort of saying, we'll try this or we'll try that. So as Tom said, when it comes to the end of it all, what we have to do is we have to have those nitrogen leaching limits, we have to have the greenhouse gas limits. And I can't guarantee, nobody could guarantee, that you are always going to come up with a better answer in terms of when those leaching limits come down. You won't. In many cases, the more efficient farmers have very little room to move. There's not much more efficiency that even the model can get out of what they're doing. They're excellent farmers. And this is the case with some of the, with farms like Pamu farm and those where really they're very well run already. The efficiencies are there, but you can still change the system around to actually get better, easier, less complex systems and perhaps more profit. But in the end, you run into a brick wall. There's nothing we can do about it.
Now, crossing to Matt Johnson, Senior Business Manager for Pamu, a former award-winning, do I dare say, dairy farm manager as well. So you know exactly what it's like moving the pieces on the chessboard around to try different outcomes, Matt. What was it that made you stand up and listen when you heard about the E2E model?
Yeah, I think for us, Sarah, is the fact that we farm throughout the country. So we've got farms from the top of the north to the bottom of the south, and each of those regions bring their own challenges around the environment and even just farm systems. And we've got some reasonably ambitious goals around leaving a better environment footprint for ourselves, as well as trying to grapple, like the rest of the farmers around the country, with what these regulations mean for us. And so we've invested a lot of time over the last few years modelling out what those farm systems need to be and what they need to be in 2020 or 2030 or even beyond. And that has been a very manual process of using different modelling tools, trying to guess where a scenario needs to start and where that tipping point may be. And after conversations with Tom and both Barrie, as we started running our farms, or a couple of farms, through the E2E model to I guess give us some insight into what it could deliver. And what it did do for us is we put all the information on our farm systems, and we really have that available. It wasn't hard information to find. We then went in, put the constraints that we've either put upon ourselves as an organisation or constraints that we may see from a regulation point of view, and let Barrie hit go. And from there, it actually provided a whole lot of answers that has taken us quite some time in a kind of traditional manual inputting, modelling, using our Excel spreadsheets and other resources. So that's where it came to us from Tom and Barrie, and that's where we kind of started our initial work with the E2E model.
And then going across the different farms that you are looking after as a business manager for Pamu, being able to maintain that sense of profitability but from less, what type of effects are you seeing on farm in terms of, particularly with labour shortages as well, feed requirements for dry matter, etc.? What flow-on effects have you seen to those operations when you can run these scenarios?
I think there's two sides to that story. I think the first one is that we set an ambitious target because we want to be good citizens in the area that we're farming. We want to protect our waterways, and in that we probably at times are at risk of overlooking what the actual best farming situation is for that particular piece of land. And so what the E2M has done is actually reined in some of our thinking and said, well, we want to be really ambitious and we want to have the lowest or the minimum viable footprint farm system is what we talk about. And to do that, you've become, you might want to halve your cow numbers or drop them by a third. And when we've run it through the model, we've actually found a lot of our systems are quite close to where they need to be. And it's only a real little amount of tuning we need to make them quite effective. And Barrie talks about the tipping point or finding that point of the rainbow where it means the most for us. So I think one of the most pleasant surprises in the actual running through the modelling was our starting point didn't need to be as courageous. That initial step to get to what our future farm system was actually quite small. It didn't necessarily mean a lot for removing all the cows off our farm or for changing what our inputs were or halving stocking rates, so we had to get rid of some staff to some of those points. It was probably reasonably a pleasant surprise, I guess you could say, to use this tool and at least get that starting point and eliminate some of the fear within ourselves and our organisation and people around what some of these regulations could mean. And as you say, it has maintained our financial performance, and sometimes it has increased it. And yes, we farm in areas of the country that it might be more difficult to do so. But overall, as a business, the model starts to show that actually times don't necessarily need to look as gloomy as one may think when we're asked to make significant changes to the inputs of our farm business or manage the outputs of our farm business.
I was going to ask Matt this question, but I didn't want to ask him something too political, so I'll go to you, Barrie. When it comes to regulation, it seems to be about banning or cutting back inputs at the top or monitoring heavily outputs out the bottom. When you said as timing and changes of government's direction from, all about doubling volume to now our environmental footprint from our farming practices, how come the consultation hasn't been done through the modelling of this, that blanket approach to regulation is not the right way of doing it?
Very political question, all right. I try not to get into politics, but despite that, I'm still disliked by people in some of those areas. I'm not sure. I think that as you said in your lead up, Sarah, we have this impression in our minds about what farming is about, and we talk about farm systems without actually understanding that we're probably naive and ignorant of what a farm system really is. And so I'm probably getting off the topic a bit, but really a lot of what politicians and their advisors do seems to me to be silo thinking. We've got to get out of that. We've got to start, as Matt said, I guess Matt was saying that their way of thinking was fairly set in some ways. I think it's better than most. I've really been impressed, but especially with the discussions with their managers as well. But basically, we've got into this habit of thinking that there's a certain recipe, protocols that we should be following for farming. But as Matt has rightly said, every farm is different. He's been around from the top of the North Island to the bottom with their farming. Everything is different. And yet we're addressing the issue in terms of the politicians as if every farm is the same. It's not. And that's the problem I see with some of the current way that the legislation is going, in that, and also with regional councils who have to implement that policy, we're looking at it as a blanket type operation. Whereas, and as I've said before, and perhaps after thinking about my talk and also Matt's and Tom's about efficiencies and about changing systems, what we have there is we have some of the better farmers, such as Pamu, who really will have difficulty reducing their greenhouse gases. But the very worst people who are using resources at the highest rate and are therefore polluting the environment at the highest rate, I can bring them back 30 to 50%, and they'll still be making the same money now as they were then. There are a few farms that I've looked at recently who will lose money as soon as we start to apply those particular restrictions. So it's going to be unfair. And I think that's because we have this, as I say, silo thinking that most farms are already at a particular stage of efficiency. They are not.
And then that leads my question to you, Tom, is that He Waka Eke Noa's website, agmatters.co.nz, there's multiple different calculators and tools that haven't been collaborative across all of the different industry groups that are there. Because sunk costs may be an issue to actually suck it up and realise of what we're trying to achieve may not be the desired outcome when we're trying to achieve these environmental benefits. So, Tom, how do you believe that we can move forward? You're there advocating for forest and bird, for freshwater quality, and in those environments whereby we can have those practical, progressive conversations that unite around that common goal of, quality waterways. So, at what point do we have to leave, agendas and egos to come together around these incredible tools like E2M, and they're not getting left in the cupboard? Sorry, that's a very long-winded question, but I think you may be able to.
Yeah, well, I think, getting to your first point, I think you're right. There's, and what Barrie said, there's been a huge, there was a huge investment in the idea that we would double our production. There has been a massive drive towards that sort of rhetoric, whether it's from industry players like Dairy NZ and Fonterra, or the government, or banks, and the metrics that we use to measure, the value of land and all those kind of things for farmers. So they've been driven a certain way. And through that process, as you say, there's been huge investment in tools, whether it's Overseer or FarmAx or all these different things that we use. There's a lot of path dependency and a lot of kind of investment and fixed investment on a certain way of thinking and a certain way of going. And I think what we kind of need to do, if we're going to address these problems that we have, because they are climate change is a huge problem and freshwater quality is a huge problem. If we're going to address these problems, then we kind of need to get over that idea of, this is the one tool that we've invested in as a company, or this is the one thing and we own the intellectual property for it and we've got to go this way, to actually go, what's out there? How can we address these issues that we've got? How can a tool like E2M that's, developed independently help us? Because, how's it different to other things? And kind of, as you say, drop those egos and go, look, how are we going to get the best outcome for the environment and for our farmers, because they have been driven down a certain way and they need help to go another way. And it would be great to see leadership from the agricultural industry, and it's great to have Pamu here, like you say, to go, hey, this is an innovative tool that we're using and we think it offers some opportunity for us. And, there is, as Barrie says, there's going to be limits. We can't solve every problem everywhere, but where there are huge gains to be made, like Barrie says, with, a 50% greenhouse gas reduction on a farm, where those gains can be made, we need to make those gains, because that's low-hanging fruit. That's stuff we can do without methane inhibitors or anything like that. We need to make those gains, and then where it's going to be more difficult to make changes, if they're already working within limits, then let's absolutely applaud that and keep them within those limits. And if we can't kind of change those systems to work within limits, then let's have an honest conversation about how we're gonna move forward, or change systems to actually fit within the environmental limits of a catchment or whatever. So you're right, it's about having an honest conversation about the tools that are out there, how we got ourselves into this position, and the kind of path dependencies that we're on, and what we need to drop away and acknowledge to actually move forward and address the environmental issues that we've got.
I've learned a new term, path dependencies. I might reuse that one. Barrie, how hard is it for an average farmer, and we have been speaking around dairy specifically, but sheep, beef, deer around New Zealand, pastoral farming, to utilise this system if it's so unknown? Is it an off-the-shelf type product? How would they begin to utilise it? And then second question is, will it be recognised when it comes to ticking the box with regional councils?
Well, to tick the box, as Tom said, for the Hiwaki Kanoa, and so it got through that. In terms of its use, I'm quite keen to see a particular manager with Pamu actually use it. It's online. It's been online for 10 years. It's available for link up. And some farmers, some people have used it online, but it's not. We've been through the problems of why it hasn't been taken up. There's a manual that goes with it, and the farmer last week was quite keen, and I believe that he had caught on quickly enough to be able to use that. Matt's watched it in progress, and he sees that in actual fact most of the things that we change in the model graphical in the first instance, so they're quite visual. And the model is available, as I say, online, and that can be viewed by me at the time it's being used. So one could say, yes, there is the opportunity to actually school up any farmer who's got really any idea about how his farm is working to use it. The big sort of brick in that particular thing is, though, that I have very little in terms of the resources to do that. So in terms of the time for a large number of farmers at one time. So I'm quite happy sort of doing it individual farms, I have been, and getting some satisfaction from that. But it really needs somebody to come in behind and just boost the whole thing up and take it much wider. I feel that, my saying is, if we get the economics right, the environment will follow. And I have seen no farm where that doesn't apply. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a simple model to use. It may seem very complicated in terms of how it's put together, but that's the thing that makes it simple. And both Matt and Tom have basically said that we can use it brutally by just sort of putting in what we want the output to be. We want the output to reduce by this much. We then have to understand the modeling or to understand systems enough to then look at something like 15, 20 tables that come with every solution. It sounds a lot, but every one of those is like a detective novel. What you see is that it's changed something. Why has it changed that? Makes you think, makes you learn, and gets you motivated. It could be the next fortnight in farming.
Mm. And I think that's what I have really taken away from it so much, is the fact that, farmers actually see how simple these calculators are, and that's where the trust has gone. They want to know that there is a complex scenario behind it, with what you're suggesting there, but at the same time simple to use, and that's the whole point of science implementation, getting those two things in balance. Matt, from a farmer's perspective, what do you think are the key things that can accelerate the likes of E2M becoming, let's use the word, mainstream in farming in New Zealand and its use?
Yeah, for us, we've got the luxury in an organisation like Pamu to have some of the most talented people in ag here, and that means that from actually our own learning and being able to use these programs is quite simple for us to become embedded in our system. But I think for farmers out there that don't have the luxury of the resource we do, to see the rural professionals out there that service our businesses take up a system like E2M is where the rubber starts to hit the road. When our trusted advisors out there on farm are starting to provide the insights into these kind of models, and to be able to take us as farmers through these conversations and provide some of the scenario analysis, and to give us kind of, I talk about it here, to be able to sort of to aim the dart and get it on the dartboard and start that conversation for us, I think is where we're going to see the most traction in a program like the E2M.
Hey, in summary, I'll start with you, Tom, and work through what's the key take home for the Ceres Country audience to move forward with E2M, Tom?
Yeah, I think the take home is as simple as what I take home from this, which is there are huge opportunities out there for farmers to address some of the issues that we've got with emissions and with leaching through simple changes on farm within the systems that they have. It doesn't have to be flash silver bullet stuff or building a herd home or a big barn. We can get the efficiencies out of some of our farms. Not everyone, but there are huge opportunities there, and E2M helps us find where those opportunities are.
Barrie?
Yes, I think we need to get out of our mindset. We need to look at what's possible, and I really do believe that farmers have been the driving reason for why I'm doing what I'm doing. And as an ex-farmer, to me, this makes sense. It's not that difficult to comprehend how to use it in the start, and you'll learn a hell of a lot. I've learned more from this model than I have in the rest of my career. It's smart.
And lastly to you, Matt.
Yeah, for me it would be if you get engaged with this thinking, if you start to challenge your farm systems by using a model like E2M, it takes you out of the mindset of worrying about the future, but it actually opens up another whole raft of questions around what your farm system may look like in the future. And I think for us as an organisation, that's been the most exciting part of this, is that actually, for us, there's other opportunities for our land, to have a viable future. But you have to start that conversation. So engage with the likes of your Barrie and E2M model.
Well, yet again, the Opinion Maker series once a week on Serious Country is always leaving me with that feeling of taking action, finding a solution through the issues and challenges we're facing. If it's making me feel like that, I'm hoping you listening are also in that position, curious to know more and intrigued on how there can be a different way to see things, because when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change, and it's considerable that there is multiple different dimensions to all of these challenges. There's no one silver bullet, as Tom said, and E2E may not be that silver bullet, yet it is another way of being able to achieve the outcomes that you're trying to, which I am likely to think, if you're a farmer and grower, is to maintain the environment that you live in and maintain profit at the same time, or better still, regenerate both. So I hope you've enjoyed your Opinion Maker this week. We're going to be back next Tuesday with this series, continuing in a bit of a different direction, but focused on a key issue facing the seafood and aquaculture industry. It sparked my interests from talking to Amy Novogratz from Aquaspark as a change maker on Serious Country. And then, of course, the documentary, or as some are referring to it, a tabloid on Netflix called Seaspiracy. If you've watched it and you're intrigued to know whether New Zealand's seafood and aquaculture is in the similar situation to the trends and facts that you would have seen on that documentary, you need to tune in. I've had some good conversations with members of our seafood and salmon industries to find out that it couldn't be more far from the truth. So therefore, let's talk around the opinions generating that next week. Continuing on tomorrow on the show, we have another change maker. If you missed last night's change maker, Willie White, farming in Hawke's Bay, and the transition into regenerative agriculture from his career as a rural banker. Check it out now on podcast. But tomorrow, our change maker is from Bidr, the online livestock trading platform that was maybe going to be a fly-by-nighter over COVID when no one could trade livestock any other way than online. Yet it is still here to stay and growing fast. What are the fundamentals, and will the livestock industry continue to embrace change? Well, Tanya Smith from Bidr, we have a great conversation around that. And of course, if you want to get in touch, Sarah at seriouscountry.com, and a big shout out to our Serious Country Club membership, which is continuously growing, where you want to keep up to date via email every Sunday night into your inbox on what is coming up, so you miss nothing, and links to what you may have missed. All that on the seriouscountry.com website. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us with your wonderful open mind to learn something new that you may have have not known before. In the meantime, take care, and we will see you again next week.